I am honored that on a day so beautiful after a disgusting winter, you've all come and are sitting in a dark room to hear me. Hopefully it'll be worth it. Chris asked me to talk about VE Day in Detroit, and the title is a little bit of a lie. What I will be talking about is what happens in the year after VE Day, and so how Detroit sort of negotiates the steps out of World War II. When the Germans surrendered, the official position of the United States government was, the war is not over, don't celebrate. And Mayor Jeffries in Detroit decided to honor that. And so in fact, what we see is the leadership of the city, certainly political leadership, but also a lot of cultural leadership, ministers and so on and so forth, we're really tamping down any kind of celebratory behavior. There is a very brief period downtown when people start throwing shredded paper out of office windows. No one seems to exactly know what kind of paper that was, but they were emulating ticker tape parades. But then immediately we're told not to do that because the war is still on and this is not a day for celebration. As a result, we do have some prayer services. Several churches offer both services for their own parishioners, and many churches in the Metro Detroit had given up large numbers of their parishioners, their young parishioners, into the military, and we certainly see lots of prayer vigils and that sort of thing in those churches. But also a number of the larger churches have non-denominational services just for those who sort of want to spend an evening in quietude thinking about the nature of the war. Mayor Jeffries will order all liquor stores and all saloons be closed for the 7th and the 8th to further hold down any kind of celebratory mode. I will point out that liquor stores and particularly saloons were one of the few sort of points of respite for Detroiters during the war, and so the whole idea of closing them down is pretty dramatic. Workers are asked to continue their production unaffected. They are expected to show up to work on time and work overtime if asked. That they are, it is assumed that they will work just as efficiently as they had been up until VE Day. The Detroit News describes the end of the war with Germany by saying, "Victory Eve was dull and prosaic. Empty downtown streets whose only crowds were those lined up for the streetcars and buses. No cheers, no laughter, no sound of music or celebration." That was VE Day. Yeah, the first time I ever offered to do a talk at another venue on this subject, I thought, oh, well, I'm going to talk about parties and stuff like that, and then I started... Yeah, and it's like, okay, no, we're not going to talk about celebrations. The city does do a few things. The city had been in brownout. It went into blackout when we entered the war, but it had been in brownout for some time. That ends after the defeat of Germany, and so the streetlights come back on. That also, all the city signs that are directional signs to fallout shelters and bomb shelters and that sort of thing. Also, they begin removing those in the aftermath of the surrender of Germany, in large part because the expectation is that the war is not going to come to Detroit for absolute certain. Most Detroiters had assumed that the war was going to end in Europe shortly, that there was a kind of assumption that everything was going to continue happening according to orders. And so in many respects, VE Day is not a surprise. And for the most part, Detroiters are primarily focused on the last phase of the war against Japan. And so in many respects, VE Day doesn't change Detroit. It probably makes Detroit a little calmer, a little quieter, but certainly doesn't entirely get people to think about the war being over yet. And I do, for those of you who don't know a lot of the detail about Detroit during the war, Detroit was critically important to the war effort. It is, of all the cities in the United States, it is the largest center of war production, if you count all of Metro Detroit and include Dearborn and Warren and so on and so forth. Michigan is the second largest state of military production. New York ekes us out, but in large part because they have so many multiple, there's Buffalo and Rochester and Syracuse and New York City and Brooklyn and so on. So our efforts in this city are incredibly important to success in this war. The entire economy is turned towards that military production during the war and actually had begun even before the war. However, Detroit was also a city, although it was Detroiters were very proud about their role in the war effort and in the armaments effort. It's also a city that had been undergoing enormous tension all through the war. That we have enormous displacement of people because of the war. There's a huge population influx, but inadequate ability to respond to that influx. That when families move here in particular, they are in particular jeopardy because there aren't spaces for their kids for school. Hospitals are grotesquely overcrowded. That grocery stores have difficulty maintaining the kind of shelf presence for the new numbers of people they're supposed to be serving. And in 1943, we have the 1943 Detroit riot, which up until that point was the largest civil disturbance in American history, and actually will continue to be the largest civil disturbance in American history until 1967. That's what it takes to actually get that off of people's radar. Although in many respects Detroit had healed since the 1943 riots, the federal government in particular did step in and attempt to alleviate some of the problems that had led to the riot. There was a much heavier hand of the police as a result of this riot, and so the kind of disorganized civil disobedience that had been occurring before the summer of 1943 does not occur so much after the summer of 1943. And so it is a more peaceful city in 44 and 45, but that does not necessarily mean that this is a wonderful, nirvanic place where everyone is happy and proud to be a Detroiter. There are still fundamental problems with the housing stock in Detroit. Before the war began, Detroit already had the worst housing stock of any metropolitan city in the United States. And then hundreds of thousands of new people arrive, all expecting to live somewhere. In the first part of the war through 1943, there was significant construction of what's called defense housing, which is subsidized housing for people who have jobs in the defense industry. But after 1943, the building trades associations and the builders associations became increasingly concerned about permanent public housing. And so the federal government agreed to, instead of building permanent public housing, that they would build what was called temporary public housing. There we go. This is temporary public housing. It does not have central heating. Most of it built after 1944 has no electrical appliances, so there are no refrigerators. The stoves that are installed in these places are coal stoves, and they simultaneously serve for cooking food and for heating the apartment. That these are extraordinarily Spartan places to live, that people only seek them out because they're a lot better than the other non-public ways of living in Detroit. But that doesn't necessarily mean that there aren't a lot of distressed people who are upset and angry and believe that they're not being treated well. As I mentioned, those with kids who are school age are particularly burdened in this environment. Schools cannot expand rapidly enough to accommodate the kids that are coming in. And so actually by the very early part of the war, every public high school in the city is on half days. So they're platooning students morning and night. Then on top of that, at night they're teaching in their shop classes, the technical training classes for the people who want jobs in the war industries. That in the elementary schools, a significant number of children are being educated in trailers, which look a lot like that. So they've got tar paper sides on them. Most of them have trouble maintaining running water because they're so badly insulated that the water pipes freeze in the winter. And so there are no flush toilets in these places and so on and so forth. So the conditions that children are being asked to be educated in are also extraordinarily meager. There is a significant burden of rationing. Probably the most impactful rationing decision was gas rationing. In 1942, the federal government establishes in November a gas ration that is supposed to limit, it is supposed to be 4 gallons per car per week. And in this climate, this means that most Detroiters don't have enough gas to be able to commute to work 5 days a week. That eventually what will happen by mid-1943 is you can ask for a waiver on that, right? So you can get, those are the A coupons. You can get extended, so if you are a defense worker, you can actually get virtually unlimited access to gasoline. So in that sense, although it's the most extreme in terms of asking people to change their lifestyles, it's something that at least the defense workers can manipulate themselves around and join carpools and that sort of thing. What people complain about more is food rationing. Because of the war, there is extensive food rationing to both help to keep prices low, but also to make sure that we have enough food for relief victims in Europe and in Asia, but also so our military has enough food. And those also tend to be fairly extreme. Generally speaking, most Detroiters are making enough money that they can actually be living very comfortably in a civilian economy. They're making good wages, they have disposable income. The problem is they don't have a lot of money to dispose that income on, or they don't have a lot of stuff to dispose that income on. One of the biggest complaints that we have is about meat. Part of the sort of cultural sensibility of Americans in the mid-1940s is that if you work hard, you need to consume lots and lots and lots of protein. And it is not at all unusual, particularly for defense workers, to work 60 hours a week. I mean, that's kind of a standard work week. And with overtime and all that kind of stuff. And so to work that way in a factory, which can be extraordinarily difficult, caloric-consuming work, and then to be told that you can't eat as much meat as you want is seen culturally as a real problem in a lot of households. We also see problems with limitations on consumption of sugar. One of the biggest fights, actually, it's one of my favorite fights of World War II. In 1943, there's a series of letters that goes back and forth complaining bitterly about sugar rationing and in the plants because plant managers want to have unlimited access to sugar so that on coffee breaks, guys can put sugar in their coffee. The federal government says, no, 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 we need to save the sugar, they can't have it. And so there's this incredible series of letters going back and forth between plant managers in Detroit and people in Washington, D.C. complaining about, how much sugar would you need? Well, how many people? All of them want sugar. How much sugar do they put in their coffee? Well, I asked, and they all said 2 teaspoons. And it's like, so first of all, they're consuming enormous amounts of sugar in their coffee, which I find shocking, drinking it totally without anything in it. But also that this is actually, I mean, people are talking about we're going to shut this plant down if we don't get our sugar. And when you're working, I can understand this. When you're working a 10 and a 12 and sometimes a 16-hour day, you would like the little things, like to be able to have a hamburger for dinner, or be able to put sugar in your coffee. And because Detroiters understand how critical they are to the success of the war effort, they feel like they are not being treated with appropriate respect. What we see is increasing workarounds in terms of rationing. Poultry is not rationed. Poultry before World War II and even after World War II immediately is really expensive. Most people feel that it's totally outside of their price point range. But because it is not rationed, because it's not really being controlled by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, we start seeing an expansion of poultry raising in the United States. And so you see butchers saying, well, you know, we can't give you any pork, but we could give you 3 or 4 chickens, you know, that would be okay. And so we do see this extraordinary increase in terms of poultry consumption in Detroit. We also see extraordinary increases of horse meat consumption. Horse meat is also not rationed. There is one store on the east side that sells 20,000 pounds of horse meat every week in 1945 to meet that sense of protein necessity. I will point out that this whole issue of meat rationing is particularly irksome for Detroiters because across the Detroit River is Windsor, and the Canadians do not ration meat at all. So if you have time, if you have a spouse who is not working at a factory, or a cousin or somebody like that, they can drive across the Ambassador Bridge, buy all the meat that they want, and bring it back across the border duty-free. That's what that second photo is. That's the customs line at the Canadian border, basically processing people who are going over to buy hamburger and rump roast and stuff like that. It is estimated that in the spring of 1945, up to 33,000 Detroiters were going to Windsor every week to buy meat. This, I will point out, absolutely pales in comparison the rum running into Windsor during the 1920s. Finally, the Canadians, because their sort of customs is so overwhelmed as D-Day, or as VE Day is coming closer and closer, begin to make noises and ultimately ban the removal of meat from Canada because their customs people are so overburdened by this practice. And so when we look at, you know, the kind of standard of living in Detroit at the time of VE Day, people are exhausted. I mean, people are exhausted because many are working just far more hours than human beings should be asked to work, that they have all of these logistical issues of being able to make sure that they get their ration coupons because you have to go to an office to collect them and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of like logistical burdens that fall on people who live in Detroit. Many Detroiters are living in what can be kindly called substandard housing, places that we would not allow people to live in today. But defense workers are working in those kinds of habituations. That in this context also, there's a sort of shifting foundation in terms of job availability. The peak of production in the United States in terms of output for almost every weapon system, not every, but almost every weapon system, was about the end of 1943. That's when we're hitting peak production. And that has a lot to do, I sort of assume that a lot of you know at least something about the military, but for those of you who might not, in the military, you have to kind of pre-stage stuff. So if you think, you know, when Eisenhower says, yeah, we're going to land 1 million men in Normandy, then you have to have all that stuff there first. which means you have to be manufacturing the tanks and the uniforms and tents and just even the kind of mundane stuff, is all going to be mostly manufactured in 1943. So that it can get shipped to Europe, so that it can be used for the invasion of the mainland. And we see a similar pattern in Asia, that the big fighting is anticipated in 44 and 45, which means that all the weapons for the Pacific theater also have to start being fairly well pre-positioned, midway through about 1944. And so already in 1944, for some industries, orders are starting to go down because there's this anticipation that we're so confident in our strategy that we don't need to keep producing at this extraordinary peak, that we can slack off a little bit, that we can diminish how much we're asking our workers to do. And on one hand, that's good because workers are exhausted, but on the other hand, this creates a level of uncertainty about, when will this all be over and how much money can I earn until this is all over and they close up shop and the war's over and I have to find something else to do. The UAW is very cognizant of this pattern and are collecting all kinds of data about what's happening in the war production plants. They estimated that since February of 1945 and until VE Day, that defense plant operations had already dropped by 20%. And so that means that there's less and less overtime, that it seems that there's less and less energetic bidding for contracts, there are fewer contracts to bid for. That Ford Motor Company has been, during the war, renegotiating its labor contracts. At the peak of the war, at the peak of all of this production, Ford contracts stipulated a 48-hour work week. So your straight time was 48 hours if you worked at the Ford plants, at least most of the ones that I've looked at. By the time we get to VE Day, those contracts have been renegotiated down to 40 hours. Because the assumption is that we don't need that sort of extra, not exactly free, but not overtime on these contracts. And the assumption is that fewer and fewer people are going to be working overtime. They're going to be working less and less. In 1943, to work 20 hours of overtime in a week is not at all unusual. It becomes increasingly unusual as we get into 1945. That this will have an impact on take-home pay and an impact on kind of forward planning about, how much money do we need to save to buy the farm in Kentucky that we're going to go back to and that sort of thing. That also, we will start seeing in increasing numbers after VE Day, folks returning to civilian life. Most of the able-bodied veterans in the European campaign, the philosophy is that they will be sent to the Pacific to help defeat the Japanese as well. And so a lot of infantry units in particular have already been told, you have this much time to cross the United States, and then you need to be in San Francisco to get on ships, and we're going to take you out to the Pacific to fight the Japanese. They don't quite say the Japanese, but I do. Some of those folks who have been badly wounded will not participate in that campaign. And so they're going to be mustered out and coming into the civilian labor force. And so we're starting to see not just this larger labor force that has been building during World War II, but also increasing numbers of veterans who are not totally disabled, but are disabled enough not to engage in the Pacific campaign. And that's going to really accelerate by the time we get into the summer of 1945 as the threat to Japan suddenly changes in August. This will have all kinds of implications for the big plants. If we're actually not having people do overtime, do we really need to hire veterans? What do we do with the people we already have? That these questions about how you treat veterans coming into the labor force, particularly this period between VE Day and VJ Day, was particularly troublesome for lots of folks because they want to be able to maintain the ability to increase again if they need to, and they don't want to have bad feelings. But on the other hand, they want to do well by the vets. So there's a lot of confusion in terms of what will happen to veterans in this interim period and how will they be absorbed in the peacetime economy. That's an issue of open debate on exactly how the logistics will be. Veterans will have preferential hiring, and so ultimately, by the time we get to 1946, they are in a preferred position. But in this 1945 period, there's a lot of questioning about what will happen next. That we do. There we go. Sorry. That some of the major plants, most notably Willow Run, shuts down production in the summer of 1945. This is because we already have the pre-positioning of all the airplanes that are needed of this type. Willow Run was one of the largest employers of all of the military plants in the Detroit metro area. And that suddenly means that these folks are going to have to be looking other places for work. And we start seeing then questions rising in other places about, well, you know, when is our plant going to shut down? What's going to happen to it afterwards? And this is certainly happening among the employees, but also it's going to include the folks who are managing these plants, the kind of corporate leadership of the big companies that are involved in this. During the war, actually as early as 1940, the federal government had been providing most of the funding for conversion of civilian plants over to military production. The construction of Willow Run was done with federal money. It was managed by Ford, but the plant was actually owned by the U.S. government. But we see this in other areas. You know, Packard had a big proving ground that was a testing center for tanks and so on and so forth. And the federal government comes in and puts all this stuff in. But the federal government's position is, you know, it was okay that we paid you to convert to military production, but we shouldn't also be obliged to pay to have you converted back to civilian production. Because all of you have been making enough money that you ought to be able to afford that yourselves. And so, you know, GM and Chrysler and all the big corporations are feeling sort of a little misused in this. That somehow the federal government, because you made us stop making cars, you should also pay to make us be able to make cars again. And so that is also a fight that is going to go through memos going back and forth between Washington and Detroit. Auto companies also are very interested in being able to redeploy their personnel. This is particularly strong after VE Day, though it had been building really since about February or March of 1945. During the war, it was not allowed, it's not exactly illegal, but it's not allowed to have any of your staff working on civilian projects once they start banning to manufacture certain things. So the automobile plants are, you know, all of their engineer teams, it's not just the assembly lines, it's everybody is figuring out how to make stuff to kill the enemy. And so all of their engineers, all the guys who used to design cars have been designing weapons since 1942. And GM can see the end of the war. And after the war, they would like to make cars again. But it's kind of been a long time that if they were to suddenly start making cars again, all they have is the old 1941 and 42 models. That's all they know how to manufacture. They don't have anything on the drawing board that actually is a kind of functioning car that they could start making right away. And so beginning in 1945, at the beginning of the year, they start calling on the War Manpower Commission to allow them to start freeing up, some, particularly their mechanical engineers, that's who they really want, free them up from these military projects and let them start designing cars again. And the federal government very much resists this idea because you never know what happens if something goes wrong. What happens if the Germans have a weapon that we don't know about? What happens if the Japanese are more resistant than we think they're going to be? Finally, on May 18th, so after VE Day, the War Manpower Commission will permit 1% of the GM workforce to start rethinking automobiles. Start figuring out what the production line is going to look like, start figuring out what the vehicle is going to look like, start figuring out where you're going to get your supplies from. But 1% of the entire workforce is still a pretty small group. During the war, in particular GM and Ford, but all of the automakers had been promising through advertisement and public relations campaigns and that sort of thing, that when they started making cars again, that these were going to be new cars. These were going to be better cars. These were not just going to be the old, sad 1941-42 cars. These were going to be real, brand new, beautiful cars that had all of the kind of advantages of the engineering changes that had happened during the war, that we learned all this about design and da-da-da-da-da. And so you're going to have brand new vehicles that are going to be better than anything you've ever seen before. And having made all these promises, GM only has 1% of its employees working on how they're going to design a full range. And they have promised a full range, that it's going to be everything down to anybody who can buy a car is going to get a brand new, beautiful, wonderful car. So it's the entire 5 nameplates are going to be affected in this. All of the big three, I should say, to be more precise, all of the big three want to begin auto production at the end of the summer of 1945 before Japan is defeated. I will just point out for those of you who are unfamiliar, the assumption was that Japan would be defeated somewhere in March, April, or early May of 1946. Because they had calculated the nuclear weapons. And so an invasion of the home islands would have required that much longer. And so the assumption is almost a year before Japan is predicted to surrender, the auto plants want to start reconverting back to civilian production and start manufacturing cars for civilian consumption. They argue that they need to meet pent-up consumer demand, that people have been driving crappy old cars for way too long and they want new cars that actually don't require a hammer to get it started in the morning and a screwdriver and all that kind of stuff, that they actually want a car that works. That also, GM in particular, by the way it calculates, believes that it has actually lost money by being a defense contractor. I will point out there are people in the government who would disagree with that sort of accounting principle. But GM in particular wants to resume automobile production because they want to make up for all the profits that they believe that they lost during the war. They believe that they can do this, they can switch back over to automobile production. They believe that by doing this before the war is over, that this will actually help labor relations, because there won't be as many people laid off, or people who are laid off will quickly be brought back into the civilian production. All of these arguments about what's going to happen to civilian conversion are going on between VE Day and VJ Day. And it creates a kind of sense of tenuousness in the Detroit economy that does make people nervous. I will point out other industries in Detroit are also under sort of similar tension. Detroit Edison, which provides most of the electricity for household consumption, but also industrial consumption. Detroit Edison is under a lot of fire. Detroit Edison has been significantly expanding the electricity grid during the war. Because they have to, because when you build plants out in Warren where they weren't there before, you got to take electricity out to them. Not to mention all the people that are moving out into Warren, and so on and so forth. That as all of that is happening, they will try to recoup some of their costs by raising rates. In 1945, once again, Detroit Edison raises its rates, it charges for electricity, and then is ordered by the state government to lower their rates because they have raised them too high, and that they are seen as war profiteers. That, I will point out, will create a certain level of tension, both against Detroit Edison, but also a kind of sense of victimhood within Detroit Edison, that we've been doing all this wonderful stuff to help the world move right. This is the appreciation we get, is you're crippling our ability to make money. Increasingly, what we see in Detroit in the summer of 1945 is the specter of strikes. In 1942, the UAW and the AFL both led an effort towards what is called the No Strike Pledge, that workers who worked in defense plants would not strike. This does not mean there weren't strikes during the war, but pretty much the union would not support them, and so we actually do have the union supporting management when striking workers who are on wildcats get fired, and the UAW supports them pretty universally. However, the No Strike Pledge only directly affected defense workers. And so during the war, we do see non-defense workers engaging in strike activities because they believe that their wages are not keeping up with inflation and cost of living and so on and so forth. That this idea of non-defense strikes being semi-legitimate, they don't make people happy necessarily, but they are seen as at least within the bounds of the law, they start expanding significantly after VE Day. Part of it is because contracts are expiring, and so they're under negotiation, and workers want to have a good contract, and so they're holding tighter and negotiating harder. And then those negotiations start to fail, and then they devolve into a strike. We also see an escalating number of wildcat strikes, strikes that are outside the sort of legitimate grounds of the National Labor Relations Board. They are caused by a wide range of complaints. The largest number of defense wildcat strikes during World War II were about race relations and what happens when an African American is made a supervisor of white workers. That's the most typical reason for strikes to break out in Detroit during World War II. But they start, who gets overtime? Who doesn't get overtime? Why are none of us getting overtime? We have an expectation. We've rearranged our schedules because we've always had overtime, and what do you mean we don't now have overtime? So you get those kinds of things, attacks on foremen, that foremen are being unfair, and so on and so forth. And so as they are increasing in terms of numbers, they are also increasing in terms of the trigger that begins them. That increasingly what we will also see is radicalized elements of the labor union becoming more liberated. That there is in Detroit a fairly strong undercurrent of leftover IWW folk who during the war years really resisted, really disliked the No Strike Pledge, but out of the kind of call for patriotism and so on and so forth would often sort of resist their personal inclinations and not go on strike and discourage their co-workers from not. But once the Germans surrender, that ability to tamp down resistance to the No Strike Pledge begins to fall away because the war's almost over and the real enemy, Nazi Germany, is done. We're going to take care of the Japanese. It's just a matter of time. We're not going to worry about it. It'll be fine. We need to create a greater solidarity with our brethren in the Soviet Union, et cetera, et cetera. And so labor activity is getting more and more volatile. What we will see is increased efforts to unionize. It's in 1945 that we get a really aggressive effort in a number of industries by foremen to create foreman unions. And this is seen as an anathema for management. That management generally in Detroit doesn't particularly like unions, but they really believe that foremen are part of management. And so the idea that foremen would want to start joining their own unions and negotiate contracts against management is seen as something that really sort of violates their sensibilities. The Auto Council, which is the sort of lead organization of auto companies, is very concerned and is trying to figure out what is the appropriate response to all of this. Then also, I will point out, the Auto Council is not simply concerned about foremen. They have, during the war, tolerated, and that's in quotes really, they've tolerated the increasing influence that labor unions, and particularly the UAW, have come to have over the political economy of the United States. That the UAW has been extraordinarily aggressive, but also extraordinarily successful in terms of not just dealing with labor policy, but dealing with these sort of larger political philosophies. They have been one of the big forces that would strengthen the Office of Price Administration, which oversees rationing and oversees price control and that sort of thing, and pursues grocers and wholesalers and so on and so forth, who are seen to be violating ration policy. Because the UAW sees it as part of their union mission to keep costs down for their membership. Not just to keep their wages up, but make sure that when they go to the grocery, they can buy everything that's not rationed. And so they have made significant inroads into the OPA. They believe that the OPA should continue to exist and are aggressively lobbying the administration that the OPA should continue to exist for at least 5 years, continuing to regulate food prices, housing prices, fuel prices, et cetera, et cetera. Also, the UAW, particularly in the last year of the war, has become very aggressive in terms of encouraging the government to think about post-war housing. What is the federal policy going to be towards the construction of new homes? Are we going to build more public housing? How are we going to respond to the fact that some cities, like Detroit, have had an enormous increase in population? Some of that population might slip away after the war's over, but not all of it will. And so how do you know, the guys, I showed you the temporary housing, if those folks plan to stay here, where are they going to live? How do we think about this? And so they're pushing the FHA to think about what's the post-war policy going to be. They're pushing the U.S. Housing Authority to kind of come up with a post-war housing policy and so on and so forth. So the UAW is making the Auto Council really nervous because it's sort of stepping outside of the historic parameters of union activity, at least according to the Auto Council. And so they feel that the union isn't going to dissipate after the war's over. It's going to become actually kind of a political agent in some respects after the war is over. And so there's a lot of tension arising between management and labor, certainly in the defense industries, but I want to point out it's across the spectrum. Kroger, the public transit, here's the bus strike. Public transit at this time is not public, it's a private corporation. And so how much do your bus drivers get paid? What's a shift? What's, all that. They're kind of hashing that stuff out. What it's going to be like after the war. And it's not happiness. It's not exactly, we haven't gotten to root hog or die, but we are less kumbaya than we have been. All of this trajectory is going to shift fairly suddenly because of the atomic bomb. The plan was that Japan would be, the homeland of Japan was supposed to be invaded somewhere between the 3rd week of September and the 2nd week of October. That was depending on weather and all that stuff. That's when the invasion was supposed to be. And so suddenly when we announced that the Japanese would surrender because we've used 2 nuclear weapons on Japan, we don't even have to invade the home islands, let alone slog through Hokkaido and then go up into Honshu and so on and so forth. That's not going to happen. The war's going to be over. This is a celebration that we all know, where there aren't orders by the mayor to shut down all the bars and saloons, where there are, edicts coming from Washington, D.C. saying no parties, no celebratory behavior. And so all of that potential energy that existed back in the first week of May, when the Germans surrendered, suddenly gets totally unleashed in August of 1945. That we essentially have a citywide party that goes on for a fairly long period of time, where work just stops. One of my old neighbors used to be a pressman down at the Detroit Free Press, and he was working the night that they got the official announcement, and they just stopped the press. I mean, literally stopped the presses, not to redo the press, but to go out and join the party. So, and I said, did that happen everywhere? He said, well, I don't know, everybody's drunk, I don't remember anything. And, so, people are climbing on statues and buildings and, being happy and crazy and sort of the way that we think about celebration of wars being over. So it's not just in New York City on Times Square with sailors kissing girls, it's everywhere in America. There's this kind of, enthusiastic party. With VJ Day, this suddenly accelerates this whole process of all of these issues that I raised about, well, where are we going and how's this going to work and what are the logistics and all that stuff. Suddenly VJ just kind of also opens those floodgates as well. GM, which had been had 1% working on a car, they made a decision that 1%, they couldn't use that relatively small, that very small, it's not relative, it's a very small group of people to design an entire set of vehicles. We're going to focus on one nameplate and one vehicle, and that's going to be their most profitable product, the Cadillac, where the technology they believe could be best utilized. And so all of their design engineers and all their folks that are building a new car are working on a Cadillac. This is not going to be the old one that was built, the last one built before the war. It's a brand new car, not exactly from the ground up, but significantly new. That they will, with enormous fanfare, release the first Cadillac, promising that soon, now that they could now take their workers out of defense work, now that the war was over, they'd be able to start using that same kind of energy for Chevrolet and Buick and so on, etc. Simultaneously, we also start seeing the groundwork for what will eventually become the Great Strike of 1946, which is the largest strike in American history, where we have this kind of cataclysmic battle between the UAW and General Motors over what are the conditions of work going to be in GM planes after the war. And so in October, this almost the same day, it's not quite, that they're rolling the first Cadillac off an assembly line. Also, we start seeing locals at GM taking votes about what are we going to do in the next contract and are we going to strike and that sort of thing. And so it is becoming increasingly clear just weeks after the surrender of Japan that Detroit is not going to suddenly be a happy place full of carefree citizens who are all trying to help one another, but there's going to be conflict in the city. That veterans are certainly going to start increasingly applying for work. That more and more, after the surrender of Japan, more and more veterans start getting demobilized and coming back home, and many of them have anticipation that they're going to get jobs. One of the most important interventions that the federal government is going to do is the GI Bill. The GI Bill has a kind of dual purpose. It's sort of, its most obvious superficial purpose is to compensate people who were in uniformed military service during the war, that you sacrificed your lives, that you had your life turned upside down, that you were threatened with bodily harm much of the time that you were in enemy territory, et cetera, and that deserves some kind of compensation. And so the GI Bill is designed to compensate people for being sort of pulled out of their families and that sort of thing. But also, a lot of the rationale for the GI Bill is to at least make sure that not everyone who was being demobilized from the military was going to start looking for a job right away. And so one of the easiest things to implement under the GI Bill is the education system. That anyone who was in uniformed service during the war and not dishonorably discharged could get financial support to go to university, but also to trade school. It's any kind of post-secondary ed. You also could get a stipend if you had left and not finished high school. And so there's a kind of broad educational desire with the GI Bill that will certainly improve the labor force, but also will give people something constructive to do rather than go right into the labor force that is already contracting. This will have enormous impact on the Detroit metropolitan area. Wayne State is the one that is in some respects going to be the most heavily affected by the GI Bill. Wayne State used to be a branch of the Detroit public school system. I mean, it was the 13th grade, essentially. And it was that way until right before the war. And so it had never really conceived itself as a major university. You get the same kind of inflow of students into MSU and U of M, but these were institutions that had existed longer and kind of understood ebbs and flows and were better prepared to deal with this. Wayne State is basically going from a very small number of students to suddenly having this wave of young people come, because they're Detroiters, and there's a university right here in Detroit. I'm going to university. I go, why not? And so beginning in January, because most of them are not able in September to start signing up, but by January, you just waves of young men trying to sign up to get a college degree. Without, I will point out, enough faculty, without enough classroom buildings, without all of that stuff that I talked about at the beginning about, we don't have the stuff. This is sort of the last phase of that. That, ultimately, I have other photographs. This is in the hall of the big yellow brick building on Cass Avenue. Old Main. And that's the hallway in Old Main. Well, they actually have to use that as a classroom space. So after everybody's all registered and so on and so forth, then what you'll have is young people in folding chairs, probably those same folding chairs that they're filling out forms with, and sitting and learning statistics and stuff. It's incredibly hard. As an educator, it's a horrible environment that nobody should have to try to survive. That the biggest impact of the GI Bill in terms of education is going to be in four-year higher ed. Huge influx of first-generation college students, huge increases in terms of completion of degrees in the next, basically 6 years or so, but certainly, really in the next 4 years, it's going to be really big. Also, trade schools, licensed trade schools also can use the GI Bill. And so when we look at, there we go, all kinds. There are no, I also have a photograph of the IBEW, the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers. They have a training school, and there's a similar picture of guys learning how to be electricians who are all there on the GI Bill. I just like this picture more because it's like, we don't really care what you want to do. If you want to be a hairdresser, that's great. Go be a hairdresser, that's fantastic. get a job, you know, that pays well, just not today. So you have this extraordinary commitment to providing benefits that at the same time really help to elevate the economy and kind of easing the way for the people who didn't go to war and are trying to figure out where they're going to work next and what they're going to do next. And then certainly the guys who are coming home and don't want to go to school, they just want a job. They don't have to be competing against, you know, the masses of all of these veterans coming back from Europe and Asia. This was originally built as defense housing. The area around the Wayne State campus was very much a working class neighborhood where there's all kinds of working class people living there in just absolutely horrible conditions. And to sort of alleviate that, in 1944, the government started building this temporary housing. And once you have all of these students, then you have to figure out where they're going to live. And so these get turned into dormitories. We see similar pattern with U of M out at Willow Run. There was a huge housing complex built at Willow Run for the Willow Run workers because they couldn't find housing and they were commuting so far. They were about that quality, if not a little bit lower. And those become married student housing for U of M. And so there's a bus that comes every half hour and schleps people over to Ann Arbor and drops them off at the university and then brings them back in the afternoon. I am appalled by the quality of housing. There's no central heat. There's no refrigerator. There's, you know, all of the things that you would, that the FHA in 1935 says. This is what you can reasonably expect in housing. Nobody should live with less than this. And yet we're building emergency defense housing, temporary, that doesn't meet those criteria. And they're horrible. And there's this kind of whole literature of letters to, you know, you can't believe what they're making us do. But eventually what we will see is an ability of Detroit to sort of step away from this. 45 is a really hard year. Early 46 is a hard time as well, for all the reasons that I've been telling you. That as time goes on, though, the economy will start shifting back to normalcy. To quote Warren Harding, products that previously had been banned from manufacture will start to be manufactured again. People can buy silk stockings. This is the line outside of Hudson's to buy silk stockings the first day of the cause. Just cause. That products start becoming more and more available, the economy starts looking more, the OPA does not continue past 1945, rationing disappears, we go back to something that resembles a free market economy over things like food and appliances and that sort of thing. And so there is certainly a kind of tumultuous period, but we do see a kind of normalcy reemerging in Metro Detroit, sort of. It's not exactly the normalcy pre-war, but some of the things that had begun before the war actually get escalated during the war. And I wanted to talk a little bit about that in closing. Detroit's population, as you can see, is steadily increasing through this period. So by the time we get to the 1950 census, we still have significant growth. Not everybody who came during the war goes back home. Some do. But actually more people come into the city because they've heard about what a cool place Detroit is. And so people are continuing to move into the city in the late 1940s and even into the early 1950s, looking for opportunity in the auto industry because it's the arsenal of democracy and all that kind of stuff. So Detroit continues. But so do the suburban areas around Detroit. And actually, that's where you see a greater growth. This is not the best way to illustrate that, but I did want to point out that it's everywhere. It's most notably in non-Wayne Detroit. So Dearborn, the Grosse Pointes, et cetera, all of that, fringe area that has been affected by the Detroit economy will continue to expand in the same way that Detroit is expanding. Oakland County will expand, and that's not just Pontiac growing. That's the entirety of Oakland. Royal Oak's population almost doubles, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Macomb, lovely Macomb, had been farmland. They barely had a sewer system out here in 1940. They had enough sewer support for a population of 50,000. Look at the population by the time we get to 1950. It was farmland. People had septic tanks. People had their own electric They weren't on the electric grid with DTE necessarily. They often had their own generators to make it. They had outhouses, exactly. And let me tell you, that's actually the greatest public threat in Detroit during the war years. Is they're terrified that there are going to be incredible epidemics in Macomb County because they use outhouses. And oh yeah, the Commissioner of Public Health in Lansing is losing his mind during that. And that population is growing as well. As the new housing, the UAW is successful in terms of encouraging the FHA to think about housing for low-income workers, creating affordable, all those bungalows that we see ubiquitously all over Metro Detroit. The FHA changes some of its financing rules to make it easier to buy homes like that. And where are most of them built? They're built out in the suburban areas. We see the same thing with the expansion of the school system. That most of the movement of the population is going to be following the plants because during World War II, the plants moved further and further away from the center of the city. And that's going to be accelerated, particularly in the 1950s, as the Eisenhower administration is terrified of the prospect of nuclear war, and so they're encouraging anything that might eventually be turned into a defense factory, leave metropolitan areas. And so all of the auto plants are moving out of the city. The ones in the city are being closed down, the units that are being built are all outside of the city. And the people are following them because who wants to drive for 2 hours just to get to work? And so in many respects, the kind of solution to the problems that were generated during World War II is suburbanization. So when we look at World War II, it's important not to just kind of, as we say in historical studies, to post-hole it, to just think of it as it's this discrete thing that is there and then it's over and then we turn the page and open up a new book and look at something different. That's not the way it works. That as we look at this transformation that's very much born out of World War II, that's going to affect the 1950s, which will affect the 1960s, and so on. So, those are my thoughts for you today. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
So where did people go to get the ration booklets, and then did they go on certain days for certain addresses? Did they use the census and the birth certificates to make sure people didn't cheat and were there long lines with their whole process?
What a lovely question. Yes, and I know the answer to it, which is why I think it's a lovely question. What they did was, if you were just a private citizen, so you're one of these people that moved up from Kentucky or out of wherever, Ohio, you went to your local elementary school, because everybody knows where their elementary school is. The OPA would take over usually the principal's office at the elementary school. And so at the beginning of every month, you would come in with all your paperwork. So once you got a ration booklet, if you didn't have to change it, it was pretty easy. You just had to stand in line and sign you know, it was annoying, but it was okay. If you were new to the neighborhood, then you had to bring all this stuff that was like, yes, here's my lease agreement, and this is how many people are in the family, and this is, you know, so you had to have all this stuff. So for nuclear families, it's annoying. It's less annoying if you are a nuclear family with children in the school district. Because if you have elementary kids at the school, they already know you because you signed your kids up, you know. So there is a trail of paperwork that they're looking at. But what happens when your cousin Henry comes to live with you and you want more rations because he's working 10 hours a day down at, you know, Willow Run or wherever, and he is hungry every night, he eats like a house, and da-da-da. Then you have to bring in paperwork that proves that Henry does indeed live with you. And that he's legit, and da-da-da-da-da-da-da. The OPA has this kind of system that I have very mixed feelings about, where they encourage neighborhood ladies to rat out their neighbors for cheating. And so you can get to be a deputy of the WPA, or the OPA, excuse me, by kind of, you have to fill out forms and swear an oath of allegiance to the federal government and all that kind of stuff. But then you don't get paid, but you can rat out your neighbors, which is almost as good as being paid in some circumstances. I have yet to see a lot of conversation about how that operates in Detroit, the ratting out part. I know that there are like fistfights in New York City over it. But I found less and less data about how that actually functions in the city. But so monthly you go in and you get your coupons. It's a mess because it's every family in the neighborhood is there. You know, it's worse than kid drop off. You know, and so it's chaos. If you're a business, I think with under 200 employees, which is a fair number of places, you don't go to the elementary school for your business because you get ration books too for gas and stuff like that to make deliveries, and you go to the middle schools. And the best I can figure out is they think that the high schools do nonprofit organizations, which means mostly churches. And I think it's because the high schools are always so utterly chaotic, they want as few people going there as possible. But they use the public school system because that everybody knows where your public school is, even if your kid doesn't go there. Even if you don't have kids, you know where the public school is. And so it actually is a system that makes an astonishing amount of sense. But it's very cumbersome because it's all handwritten on cards and stuff. So if there's ever a fire, we're all in trouble. Yes, sir?
In your research, you showed a picture, I believe it was like Dearborn Folger, like showing one of the privately owned and operated transit bus companies. Of course, the predominant area of Detroit and some municipally owned Department Street railways. Were the cities allowed, were their employees also locked in with a no-strike clause during the war?
There's strikes and there's strikes.
Because I don't remember, my dad worked at the DSR, I don't think they had any strikes.
No, they don't. They do. There are a couple of work stoppages, more in 43 because the DSR drivers are feeling that they're not getting appropriate security, that it's too dangerous, that, you know, crazy people are throwing and people are shooting at the buses and the trolleys. And so they're not really striking. In the, you know, it's not about contracts and stuff like that. It's just about, you know, we're not going to leave until you bring a cop down here to ride on the bus with us. So that kind of thing is happening, but that's not really a strike. So you're right to point out the public transit system in Detroit, but there is also parallel private transit systems operating in the city. They're much smaller, but are trying to fill some of the slack that's been created by all of these people trying to get to work in the morning. Yes, sir?
I noted you were writing a book on Detroit in World War II. Could you comment, if you have information, on successful espionage in Detroit or protecting the arsenal of democracy during that period?
Yeah, I'm actually looking at FBI records, internal records this summer. So there might be stuff that's happening that I am not aware of. There is, to me, a surprising paucity of that. Now, having said that, there are Nazi agents in Metro Detroit. Parker Sage is the most notorious of them. And he is using kind of rightish organizations, the Working Man's Party, which is kind of this crypto-Nazi movement. But he's not very successful because there's just not a lot of, the Bund was pretty big in the city before, until about 1938. But after the invasion of Poland, the Bund loses a lot of its resiliency, and a lot of people get kind of disgusted with it and stop supporting it. So he's got a fairly small group of people to tap into. The FBI is clearly monitoring him. Ooh, forgot this was on wheels. The FBI is clearly monitoring him and other people. He will be arrested several times. He spends a lot of the war actually in jail. He was involved in the Sojourner Truth riots in 1942 when they tried to push, there was housing for African American defense workers in a white neighborhood, and the local population is very upset because it's basically race busting the neighborhood. And he taps into that along with some of his political allies to try, and there's a significant riot up at 7 Mile and Fenland over whether or not these black defense workers are allowed to move into their apartments. And he is one of the 3 people who's indicted for inciting a riot after that. So he spends, I think it's 9 months in jail awaiting trial. And then he's temporarily, so he spends a lot of time. They keep letting him go because they want to follow his connections. And it's hard to do that when he's in jail. So they keep, it's kind of a weird relationship that the FBI has with him. I think most Detroiters believe in the war. I've seen very little naysaying about the war as a good thing. I think they are patriotic. They also want a job, here's this, wonderful opportunity to be patriotic and make a lot of money all at the same time. So, this idea of subverting military production is something that isn't going to find a lot of support in the plants for a variety of practical reasons. So they're there. There are a couple of incidents, but there's a lot of guards at these plants. The big plants all have military personnel guarding them, but also private security forces guarding them. So there's a lot of inspection of badges as people come to work in the morning. There's a lot of, that kind of stuff. There's one case that I'm thinking of where a guy, it was at the Rouge, was going to work one day, and he had been fired the day before because he was drunk at work and picking fights with his foreman and threatening to beat up his foreman and da-da-da-da-da. So they fired him, and he came back to work the next day. And so they had torn up his badge, and so he tried to get into the plant without his badge, and then the next thing you knew, he's got 20 guys beating him over the head with billy clubs, keeping him from getting into the plant, and everybody's like applauding, saying, yeah, he was stupid, And so I think to subversively get somebody into the plant to engage in espionage is pretty complicated and pretty difficult. From what I've seen of the security, it's pretty decent. And I think more importantly, I think most people who are working in the plants want them to produce stuff. So for both self-serving and patriotic reasons. So this is not to say there aren't spies. Of course there are spies. There are always spies. But are they impactful? I'm a little dubious. And I will say at the end of the war, they all get released. Everybody in FBI custody who was under, as a Nazi saboteur, and Parker Sage is one of them. This is why I want to look at the FBI records. What were you thinking? In 1946, they were all released. They're just like, yeah, never mind. War's over. It's okay. What? And so I don't think you treat somebody that you thought was a genuine threat that way. I think that it's more, he's a nuisance and you don't want him to become a threat, so we kind of make his life in line. Yes?
Yes, the guy who got fired for fighting with his boss, and he was back the next day. I could see he was much needed. They changed his.
Yeah.
Did he ever get back in?
Oh no. He was drunk when he came back too. So it was bad enough that he came back. He could not even claim that I don't remember any of that. It's like, yeah, bring him over here, I'll be his, the kind of foul language that you get on the shop floor. So yeah. And security systems, they don't meet what I would say is a kind of modern standard of security, but they're big. And they're large men with sticks who hit people with them. Yes?
You mentioned that you had access to the FBI records. Do you think the employee records at Willow Run, Rouge, some of those factories, will ever be unsealed? Because a lot of us don't know if we had a mother or an aunt who worked there because they did their patriotic duty, and then they just didn't talk about it sometimes, or else they were told not to talk about what they had done.
It's really problematic because that kind of stuff, I think in my own heart of hearts, having talked with archivists at NARA in Washington, is that on the basis of my conversation with them, I have inferred, perhaps incorrectly, but I have inferred that no, they're not, because there's even a suspicion that they're in such bad shape, they're not really, there probably are parts of the record that are readable, but what a lot of these plants did was they just kind of boxed stuff up. And Willow Run is particularly problematic because it goes through so many hands and it gets closed down periodically because this purpose isn't working and whatever. And I'm sorry to say that I'm not sure that we're ever going to process any surviving personnel documents. Now, I would love to be wrong about that. Because I myself would, I've been lucky because I've been able to look at some of the electricians' records who operate very differently than guys in plants. But even, I have only seen people whose last name, it falls between an R and a Z because they have no idea where the rest of them are. They just don't know. They're just lost. And they're, particularly if they were written on wartime paper, it's really crappy paper. And it just kind of falls to dust after a while. And it molds easily and, which is really sad because there is a lot of that kind of fine-grained stuff that I would love to know. And I know a lot of people that certainly if you've got relatives that have done it, you really want to know. But yeah, I think it's highly problematic.
Thank you so much.
Oh, absolutely. I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news.
No, I've heard it before, but I was just checking, but I hadn't heard about the R through Z, so thank you.
Yeah. So I can tell you the people named Russell and Thomas and
Still it?
I might, yeah. Off the top of my head, I don't know.
Back to the rationing. So the women that were working, the Rosies, how did they get their stamps?
It was awful. Because they, now, if your mom was living with you, you'd send her.
Yeah.
But otherwise, and this is the real problem with women in the workforce, is that, the expectation is they do all that kind of household stuff. And so they're supposed to come into work late or leave early or depending on what their shift is. And, you know, they're, particularly in 42, there's a huge push because they can't build housing fast enough. So somebody has this really, you know, you can kind of see it emerging. Somebody has this bright idea. Well, we have all these unemployed women, let's just make the women work in the factories. Then we won't have to have any new families come in. But they don't go past that. And so the whole logistical thing of, you know, and not all of them, but about, I think it's about a third of the elementary schools go on half days, and it's by grade. So, you know, if you have a kid in the first grade and a kid in the fourth grade, man, you just have to hope for the best and pray nobody kills anybody, you know, because you got one kid in the afternoon, one kid in the morning, and you work from 7 to 3 when you don't get overtime. And you might work at Willow Run, and if you live in, you know, it just gets, you know, one of the gas rationing I mentioned about the problem of, you know, how to get to work, because the average commute distance is 10 miles during the war. And that's a long commute, particularly if you've got little kids and you've got husbands that want to be fed when they get home off shift and that sort of thing. And you don't have gas, or you maybe only have one car. And I interviewed this guy whose father worked, they lived in Pontiac, his father worked at Warren, and his mother worked at Willow Run. He got the car, the dad got the car, mom was in a carpool. But then Willow Run was having so many problems with traffic jams in the morning because too many people are coming down that highway and you can't get them through, that they decided they were going to stagger their start time. So if you're in a carpool with 4 people from Pontiac, and one of them starts at 6 a.m., and one of them starts at 7, and one starts at 10, and one, then you've got to come down for the first person, and then go home when the last person has been signed out. So it's insane. It's insane. So yeah, this is why women quit so much, because you can only do that for so long before you lose your mind and kill somebody. Hopefully it's not your kids.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming out.